So I suppose, we churches ought to say to ourselves, we better be preaching Christ because that is the answer. He is the answer. And the very thing that the world is burning down their own towns trying to figure out, we have in Christ.
Welcome to the Christian Music Archive podcast, conversations about Christ, community, and music. I'm your host, Dave Maurer. I'm really excited to share with you my conversation with Randy Thomas. Randy is currently the worship leader at a church in Fort Myers, Florida, but before his tenure as a pastor, he was a member of the Sweet Comfort Band for nearly a decade, before moving on to start the band The Allies. Oh yeah, and he also wrote a little song called Butterfly Kisses with his songwriting partner Bob Carlisle. Together they wrote songs for a number of country artists, including a #1 hit for none other than Dolly Parton. I'm eager to let you hear Randy's heart for sharing Jesus with people. As Randy stated in the opening, Jesus is the answer that people are looking for, and we as Christians have the opportunity to share that answer. I love his passion about sharing Christ. But before we jump into our conversation with Randy, I'd like to mention that I would love your help with this podcast. You will notice that I don't have any advertisers, so all of the hosting fees and production costs to produce this podcast each week come out of my own pocket. If you appreciate these conversations with Christian artists, won't you consider helping? For about the same price as an iced mocha frappuccino, you can help cover the costs of producing these conversations each week. Head on over to patreon.com/ccmexchange to learn more about how you can help. And again, that's patreon.com/ccmexchange. Thanks for your interest and willingness to help. Well, welcome, Randy. I'm glad to have the opportunity to chat with you. It's been fun for me as a music fanboy to connect with some of the people that I've long admired, and I've been a huge Sweet Comfort and Allies fan for years and years. So it's good to be able to get to chat with you for a little bit.
Well, I appreciate it so much. Somewhere there's somebody online that tried to pay me a great compliment and called me a killer guitarist. So I want to go on record saying I have never actually killed anyone with a guitar.
Well, you are. I heard an interview with Brian Duncan a few days ago that he talked about you as one of the most gifted guitarists he knows. So that's a good compliment, I think.
That's kind of him. We recently had a conversation. I think Brian and I did some concerts together, 2012, and at some other point, 2015. I get my years mixed up, but I remember conversations perfectly. But but he turned to me and said, "I never realized, that how good you are," because he had been in a band with me, and you
Yeah.
just have your guitar player in your band. What's the big deal?
Yeah.
And I think his wife turned to him and said something about my playing, and I had to admit the same thing to Brian. I said, well, I thought you were a pretty good singer, and we got back together and we did another record together, and I realized, hey, he's really great.
Hindsight's 20/20, right?
Yeah. So I think in our sunset years, Brian and I were becoming fans of each other.
Oh, that's fun. That's fun. Well, you have had, Sweet Comfort and Allies are not all you've done. You were in, speaking of sunset, you were in Sunrise, right? And Psalm 150.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of
Okay.
early Jesus stuff.
Okay, to go into the early history, yeah, I'm surprised you were familiar with Sunrise. There was drummer of the band was Steve Latination, who played with Brian and a lot of people.
Yep.
Bass player was Matthew Chapman, who played with Allies and a lot of people. The guitarist Mike Hodge is over at Lakeland Church in Houston. You may know him, and Sam Scott, who was later in Allies. All these people that we had a band called Sunrise, which that was a very 70s name for a Rialto dance band. And as we sort of learned to play our instruments, one by one, everyone in the band became Christians. And then we switched. Uh, we used to have a bass drum, where you put your name on the
Right.
drum set. Uh, and we just changed the U into an O, and we became Sunrise.
Ah.
And um, and then the Christian band Sunrise became communal, and we were sort of basing our lives and copying a band called Psalm 150, which was
Oh,
based
sure.
in San Bernardino, California. And Psalm 150 was later a band that there was a mass exodus where a bunch of them left and they became Andre Crouch's band.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's an important part of musical history, I think.
Yeah.
So when James Felix and Glenn on sax and um, these different musicians had left Psalm 150 to play with Andre, that's how Sam and I then got in the band Psalm 150, and we were sort of a band that played. It was like Earth, Wind, and Fire. It was a
Mhm.
horn band. We went and played prisons and all of that. And during those days, we would run into Sweet Comfort. And
Okay.
Sweet Comfort was a little bit odd because you had the blonde piano player who would sit down at the piano, and a bass player and drummer would play along, and it just sounded like something was missing.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, they were taking a lot of grief saying, "Well, you guys are gonna be good when you get a guitar player."
Uh-oh.
And, uh, which I think Brian had some resentment for. And, and that led to, somehow, there's a poster somewhere. There was a concert with Sunrise, Psalm 150, and Sweet Comfort Band, and we all played together
Oh, no
at
kidding.
Pacific High School Auditorium somewhere in the mid 70s. And because they had seen me play and they were getting so much grief about getting a guitar player, that led to I actually had auditioned to play at Calvary Chapel Riverside, and you had to audition through Kevin, the bass player with Sweet Comfort Band.
Right.
So Kevin had said, "Well, I've seen you play guitar. Let's go over to my house and jam." And so, just purely on a whim, went over to Kevin's house. His brother comes over, starts playing drums. Brian comes over, starts playing piano. And we laughed about it later, where first they said, "Well, why don't you come play a gig with us at Knott's Berry Farm?" And then there was something else that, maybe uh, it was playing at a Calvary Chapel. And so one by one, I kept doing things with Sweet Comfort Band, and I was never officially asked to join.
Oh, no kidding.
I think Kevin and I later realized that, I got in the band and we never officially signed me on. I just, bit by bit started playing, and then we made a record, and it became a joke that, I never really officially joined this band.
You became one of the primary songwriters as well, right? You and Brian kind of penned everything.
Well, the way if you look at the first record, Brian wrote so much of the first record, and I consider my contributions to be the beginnings of trying to learn how to write songs. So I co-wrote a song with Brian and Rick that was "Childish Things," and I brought a song. It's kind of embarrassing. His name is "Whispered," where that was one of the very first songs that I had written.
Hmm.
So the second record, as is often the case, Brian had poured so much into the first record that he was a bit of a dry well on the second record.
Ah.
So I noticed that if I would sit down with Rick, the drummer, if Rick would say, let's do a song like this, and I would co-write something with Rick, it would get on the record.
Ah.
So I think Brian would agree with me that the second record, Rick and I presented so much material that we sort of became a threat to his dominance as a songwriter. And then you'll notice on subsequent records, I think the healthy thing that developed in Sweet Comfort Band was Rick and I would write a song together. Well, then Brian would write a song together. Then Brian would need help with a song, and I might write it with him. And we had this interesting balance of competition and cooperation. And I think the band really benefited from. I noticed that whenever I wrote a song that Brian really respected, he would get depressed.
Uh-oh.
Uh, and then he would respond with the best song he'd ever written.
Ah,
So
interesting.
the bruising of egos led to some very good things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the genesis of your writing then started with Sweet Comfort.
Yes, because if you, thankfully, there's very little remaining recorded evidence of the songs that I wrote in the band Sunrise. They were horrible. I can say that with all confidence. I've got witnesses. I was the primary writer, I suppose, but when Sam was beginning to write songs but all of us were so amateurish that the songs were just horrible. So there's this wonderful thing that happens when you're trying to get a song up to a level that other people will appreciate it,
Yeah,
and then it gets on a record and other people hear it. There's something about knowing that someone is going to witness what you're writing, that causes you to think, well, this better be good, and you
yeah.
improve.
Well, and that's like any other skill, right? The more you work and the more you practice it, the better you get, hopefully.
Yes, and as simple as that sounds, I find that yes, those that become professional songwriters, probably nearly without exception, every great songwriter has learned how to do a lot of what I call rewriting. You may have an idea and then you throw it out, and then or you may have a piece of music. You may write multiple sets of lyrics to it. So I've had an interesting time living here in Fort Myers, Florida, where they have a gathering of songwriters here.
Ah.
And without getting myself in trouble, I won't name any names, but I had a presentation with these guys where I sat down and kind of did a little 1 day seminar
Yeah.
saying, this is how you could be a better songwriter. And they started arguing with me.
Uh-oh.
And I realized that there are many amateur songwriters that actually they just want to continue to write amateur, bad, horrible songs.
Mm,
And and it's not a pretty sight, and it's not fun to listen to. Uh, but I think there are those of us who started as horrible songwriters. Um, the way that you grow out of that may be in co-writing with someone and with
right.
competition, like Brian and I did, and just sort of rising to the occasion to know that, okay, if I'm going to get a song on a record, it has to be better than some other song that's submitted, and
Mm,
the competition is good. So all that to say, yes, there was a process of rewriting and throwing out. Uh, I think any songwriter would tell you that it's not as if all of us songwriters have these brilliant ideas and we sit down and we always write a brilliant song.
mhm,
Most of us will say we have goofy ideas and we have to sift through all the different ideas that we get. We find a little gem, and then
mm.
even then we have to rewrite it and work on it in order for it to be good. So I think you will never, there's no end to mining the depths of how things like songwriting are both you need the inspiration that comes from God and the talent that comes from God.
Sure. Yeah.
But there is also something called song crafting, where you have to learn a craft and get good at your craft.
Well, so you did a number of albums with Sweet Comfort, and that kind of came to an end. And the Allies was your next venture. Was that a natural progression, or was that something that you said we've got to put something together now that Sweet Comfort Band is done?
Yes, we did. We did 6 records if you look at the Sweet Comfort Band catalog, and then you can always tell in a record store in those days when someone put out a best of, those of us in the music business go, "Oh, the band must be breaking up."
Yep,
Uh,
they're fulfilling
so
a contract.
so the best of means there's no more records coming. And so um, we were we had been working with Dino and John Elefante, and
Right?
Dino was the guy who turned to me at some point, and he had said, "I know what you're going to do. You're going to start another band, and and I've got a name for you." And he had a dramatic pause, and he he speaks with his hands, and he puts his hands up in the air, and he says, "Allies."
Oh, no
And
kidding.
yes, he just announced the name to me, and uh, so I sort of at that point went around and tried to find a combination of musicians. There was a band called Idle Cure, and
Sure.
uh, it was one of those guys that I talked to, and some of my old friends like Mike Hodge and so forth, where I had tried different combinations of putting some musicians together, but it seemed as though I couldn't put the band together
Huh.
because Sam Scott literally showed up on my doorstep and said, "Let's start a band with Bob Carlisle." And Bob had been a guy who you'll notice that we called him in to sing with Sweet Comfort Band. He was
Right.
on
Yeah.
some of those, yeah. And but Bob was another of the alumni, or however you say it,
Yeah.
of Psalm 150. We had played
Right.
together in that band. And but my respect level for Bob was so high that I thought, no, there's no way we could get Bob Carlisle. So we went to a club called Rosie's in Rosemead, California, and we heard Bob playing with a bar band, and he was brilliant as always, but still he was
Yeah.
just playing in a bar. And so during a break, Sam and I just said, "What do you think if we start a band?" And I thought he would say, "No thanks, fellas,"
Right. Right.
Uh, but it turned out that God had Bob, at a place where he was desperate to get out of bars and to uh, stop being in what he called bar world.
Yeah.
And and I remember one of his first questions was, he said, "Well, is this going to be a ministry where we all starve and we don't make any money,
Right.
or or is this going to be a band where I can feed my kids?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Yes."
Ah. Yeah.
And
Good
Bob never
answer.
Yeah, and Bob never forgot that we could actually be an evangelistic ministry on the one hand, but we had
Yeah.
hopes to actually feed our children while we did this, and that's what Allies became. We went with Sam. We started our first record, and Sam left after 2 years, and Bob and I continued on, and again, we did about 6 records before the transition out of Allies
Yeah.
was that Bob, I remember, just said, "Let's not do the beating the dead horse tour."
Ah.
There are some Christian artists whom I shall not name who they seem to, after after maybe the act should have died,
Yeah.
they just continue to make records
Mhm.
as if they didn't know what else to do. And so Bob and I got to a point where we moved to Nashville, and we'd been doing it about 9 years, and Bob wanted to do a solo record, and I was experiencing deja vu from
Yeah.
uh, with Sweet Comfort Band. Of course, Brian
Yeah.
had a long, illustrious solo career,
Right.
And so here we go again. The singer's leaving and going to do a solo record. That was a peaceful transition where we just simply we decided to shoot the horse rather than try to ride the dead horse.
Yeah.
I think that this may or may not interest you, but I think the end of Sweet Comfort Band was the typical ending of a band in that Brian and I were the malcontents. We wanted to go on and do something else. Rick and
Mm,
Kevin wanted to continue the band as it was, and we had a typical unfortunate band breakup where two of us needed to have a creative change, and two of them, being brothers,
right.
we broke into two camps, and that was the end of that. You know,
Well, the lesson I think we learn, just real briefly about Randy is that if you wanna start a band with a good vocalist, have Randy put it together because, I mean, you got the powerhouse of Brian Duncan, you got the powerhouse of Bob Carlisle, and then you team up with Andy Denton, a powerhouse vocalist, to
wow,
put together Identical Strangers.
yeah, wow, you know your Christian music history better than I do. Uh,
I'm kind of addicted. That's why.
yes, that led to uh, the question after Allies was over with. I view that as there was such a transitional time and things were changing, and there was much more of a sense of, I think when I look back on Sweet Comfort Band uh, and Sunrise and Psalm 150, we just did what we did. We just sort of followed
Mm,
our noses, and God was in it, you know.
right.
And then I think when we started Allies, I became more what's the word? There were things that were more thought through and they were more planned,
Yeah,
and you're in danger of things being fabricated, but still, God has His hand in all of these things.
absolutely.
Uh, And so I think to some degree I was suffering by the time that we put Allies to bed and we were going to do something new. I was trying to figure out what is going on in the music world. Now, instead of just simply following my nose, if I just continued to make music that sounded like it was from the 70s or the 80s, I was going to be in trouble. So there were stylistic changes and there was just things going on in what was being played in radio and where the art of music was heading. And I had to actually break down and listen to, what was going on in Christian radio and secular radio. And so we set off on Andy and I wanted to try to sort of create, well, what is the sound of Identical Strangers? I don't know. And we tried to sort of create a sound that was sort of, you know, uh, it couldn't help but be sort of retro because of my influence, maybe.
Yeah,
And then we were looking to fit in with what was going on Christian radio, and we were trying to make it updated and current, you
right.
know. So what you're shooting for is nowtro,
Oh,
and
yeah. Good word.
yeah. So I think if you listen to Identical Strangers, you'll hear, there's sort of, I think I felt at that time like if we have influence from the 60s and the 70s, that's okay. But
Sure.
if anything sounds like it's from the 80s, they're going to hate us. So we sort of had this rule of now it's the 90s, we can't do anything that sounds like it's from the 80s.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
and Andy was a great partner and singer, and uh, unfortunately, that was interrupted by having a hit song, and
Yeah.
I needed to sort of get out of the artist side of Christian music at that point.
Well, so that kind of dovetails then into one of the questions I was gonna ask is because 'cause you've written songs for a ton of people, of course, probably the most well-known is Butterfly Kisses, but you've also well, maybe not most well-known because Dolly recorded one of your songs, what is it? "Why'd You Come In Here Looking Like That," right? That's probably even bigger than Butterfly.
Yes, thank you for thank you for doing your homework and knowing. Now I'm getting my yeah. If we had a timeline in here, in the middle of the Allies timeline, what really shook Bob and I up is when Sam left the band, Bob and I started becoming a songwriting partnership.
Okay.
And the reason that's significant is we had a year, it was somewhere around 1986, in which our record contract came to an end. Um, we didn't have a manager, we didn't have a booking agent, we didn't have a record contract, all the things that you're supposed to have.
Right.
And Sam left the band, and it just looked like it was all in tatters. And Bob called me up one day and said, "What do you think if we just start a band called Allies, and you and I will just write all the songs?" And and he made this pitch to me because he had witnessed a duo of songwriters, Steinberg and Kelly, and Billy Steinberg had hired Bob to sing and play on these projects that these two writers did. And Bob had just watched these guys live in Los Angeles, be songwriters, and make a living just writing songs.
Not have to be on the road, not have to do all of that kind of stuff, just kind of a 9 to 5 kind of a thing.
Yes, and they literally sort of clocked in every day just writing songs.
Wow.
And Bob wanted to. He said, I think we can do that. And so that was his proposal, that we become this songwriting team, and we try to consider ourselves, uh, and we started a publishing company called Carlisle and Thomas Songs.
Hmm.
And so you'll notice that from then on, everything was written by Bob and myself. But that led to then Bob showed up one day in a 65 Chevrolet truck that he drove. And he just drove up in his truck and said, "What do you think if we write country music?" And based upon my childhood experience of listening to classic country, I said, "I think I can do that."
Okay.
And although my influence in country music, there was a lot of things that happened in the 70s and the 80s that I wasn't paying attention because I was involved in rock and roll and Christian music.
Right. Yeah.
And so I knew that a lot of my influences went back to the 50s and 60s country music. So Bob and I started listening to what was going on in country music, and he said, "I think we can do this." And the first song that we wrote was "Why'd You Come In Here Looking Like That?" Then during those days, it was Benny Hester came over to the studio, and for some reason I played Benny the song, and then for some reason Benny said, "I think I could take it to Nashville and I can get a bunch of major artists to listen to this song."
Wow.
Now we had no experience with the whole song pitching thing and all of that, and somebody other than us recording a song. So I handed him a cassette, and I thought, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Expecting probably nothing will come of this. And then we got the phone call from Nashville saying Dolly Parton has recorded your song.
Wow.
And
That must have been surreal.
it was the strangest thing. And a good example is, where Bob and I were out playing dates, and at one point we were sort of at a small town Holiday Inn, and we were playing a gig with Allies. So there began to be this interesting juxtaposition of where Bob and I were playing this little Holiday Inn, and we felt like our careers were, our performing career in some ways was, as Bob used to say, we have scratched and clawed our way to all the way to the middle.
Yes.
And so here we are feeling like our career, as you're looking at it compared to an Amy Grant or a Smitty,
Yeah.
we felt like, we are the mediocre ones. Uh,
Right.
and we're sitting in this little restaurant on tour with our band, and then over the system, wherever we were, it might have been, somewhere in Wyoming, but
Yeah.
when we heard our song, "Why'd You Come In Here Looking Like That?" from Dolly Parton, suddenly Bob and I looked at each other over our morning eggs and coffee, and we felt like, I think we've arrived.
Yeah,
There was it was really strange to be doing, Christian music and have a number one hit in the country world,
crazy. Yeah,
and Dolly did that for us.
yeah. So you have written a ton for folks, right? I mean, a lot of the country market.
Yes, that led to a time where when we lived in Nashville, I was there for about 20 years and Bob was there about 20 years. When you live in Nashville, there's so much going on that then I switched mentalities where I was writing for Polygram Music, which is
Okay.
now uh, Universal.
Oh, okay.
Um, you'll find those of us, who used to be in the music business. Remember back when there was a music business?
Yeah,
What
exactly.
what was really common, it happened to the Beatles, it happens to everybody, is you sign a contract with somebody, and then later in your life, someone else buys that company,
Yeah,
and uh, and so I signed a contract with Polygram, and I should have known that now later in life, that's Universal. It'll be
yeah.
somebody else, and you wind up not knowing anybody at the company where you worked,
Mm,
and so I spent a few years there just writing music, and Bob and I had a bunch of cuts. We had I don't have my resume in front of me, but we had, there were Colin Ray, there was Hank Williams Jr., there was Engelbert Humperdinck.
oh, wow.
Uh,
That's a name.
there was all kinds of folks that you're getting someone else. There was Lila McCann was one of them. Getting people to record your songs. So I really was trying to get into the Nashville mentality of you write a song and then somebody else records it.
Yeah,
And which is interesting because what I didn't foresee, and I think what God teaches us sometimes is we go chasing after things, and
right.
butterfly kisses. We should get to that. Was the song that was really I didn't see it coming. Where
Yeah,
it was Bob and it was he and I and it was our partnership, and that was the sort of the crown jewel of 12 years of writing together. So
yeah.
I've talked in circles too much. You need to ask me a
No.
question and
No.
bring me back on track.
No, this is all fascinating. Actually, I am pushing you in a certain direction because I know for a couple of years you toured with Shania Twain as a guitar player, which means you're no slouch. So if you were to say, do you prefer the songwriting side or do you prefer the guitar playing side, the performing side?
I guess there is no preference. My experience, in 2020,
Yeah.
now that there's sort of their songwriters cannot really make a living being a songwriter any longer.
Hmm.
And so I would answer that saying the problem is where I sit now. Songwriting just can very easily feel pointless because there's just really no way to make a living at it. I still spend a lot of my energy collecting guitars and playing guitars and rehearsing. I'm still very active as a guitarist.
Yeah.
But, the terrible truth that happens in life is uh, when you're in your 20s and you're in your 30s, it seems as though, people, there's this interesting combination of you have a tendency to make music that is on the creative edge of something.
Okay.
And, and then when you appear on stage, you are relevant. And your struggle when you get to be in your 60s is, you know, uh, when you play guitar, people are always sort of like in my case, the reaction is the surprise, like, oh, grandpa has skills, you know.
Yeah.
There's sort of this, you just no longer fit the profile of someone who's supposed to be on stage or supposed to be writing songs.
Hmm.
But to try to answer your question, if I preferred, writing songs or guitar, I I would say that there was a point at which, I would spend a lot of my energy writing songs in the Nashville years. Uh, and I might spend less energy playing guitar. But the
Hmm.
two are so tied together that I would say I enjoy it all. But
Two sides of the same coin.
yes,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
think because if you look back at my history line, and um, I'm glad that I've had a history where the bands that I've been in nearly lasted a decade.
Hmm.
uh, where there's a great history of rock and roll bands. If there's something good enough to make the band, hit and have a great song or have a great singer or have a great record, you'll notice that the life expectancy is anywhere from 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had good relationships with great people and had a really long run. But uh, I think that my thinking was back when I was the middle of all of it, and this is going to sound terrible, but I'm just going to be honest with you.
Oh, well, thank you.
My
That's fine.
my thinking was a lot of these singers, they can write a song and they can sing it, and they've got an advantage over all of us.
Mm, yeah.
And so I think that my thinking was, I need to be writing songs. I need to be playing guitar. I need to sing as well as I can. I need to uh, and you'll notice that I wound up being a recording engineer on a lot
Mhm.
of the projects. I wound up being a producer on a lot of the projects, where I wore as many hats as possible so that my kids would be able to wear shoes.
I like that phrase, yeah. Well, so this kind of morphs into because ultimately, for me, Christian music is about Christ, and
Mhm.
it kind of morphs into the next phase of your life, which I'm always interested in hearing specifically about musicians who decide, I think God's calling me into the ministry now, not the touring singing ministry, not that that's not ministry, but into the pastoral ministry. And you spent some time, I think, didn't I understand you went back to school even, started studying, and you're now a music pastor. How did that transition come about? Or how did God kind of say, okay, time to look over here for a while?
That came as, I think, the fallout of Butterfly Kisses. Now this is interesting because the song was number 1 for 7 weeks, uh, in the summer of 1997. I think I got all my numbers correct. And so it was a real phenomenon. It sold 3 million records, it sold 1 million singles. So the success of that thing just sort of, it was so huge that it was life-changing. So that was wonderful, and I think between 97 and the end of the last century that we were in, um, I sort of ran around confused for a few years.
Huh.
Um, so I don't expect anyone to feel sorry for me, but sometimes when you win a Grammy and when everything goes right, it destroys a lot of things.
Interesting. That's an interesting perspective.
It destroyed Identical Strangers. I think it caused me to, not know. I think that after we wrote Butterfly Kisses, you'll notice that Bob and I wrote A Father's Love,
Right.
and it was our follow-up to Butterfly Kisses. And comparatively, compared to the gigantic success of Butterfly Kisses, A Father's Love was put in a what was his name? Michael Keaton
Yeah.
movie called Jack Frost. And as Bob once said, if you watch the movie Jack Frost back in those days, uh, you would go see the movie and you would think, that probably wasn't Michael's best movie.
Yeah.
And then after you left the theater, the guy who was sweeping up the popcorn when they played A Father's Love, you know, he might have stopped sweeping up popcorn for a minute, going, "Hey, that's kind of a nice song."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the difference between A Father's Love and Butterfly Kisses.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm being cruel, but it's just fun to tell these stories. Um, and so you really have a little bit of a crisis of how do you top that? You just can't top that.
Mm.
And I also had a little bit of a crisis with, I thought, well, now that we have a hit song that's that big, then all kinds of other things will follow. And and it just seems like things didn't follow. It seemed like, we had gone to the mountaintop, and now everything else felt like a letdown. So
Mm.
that was my long road to get to this. When you experience, some people have to hit bottom, I think, before they really, really look to God.
Mhm.
And in some ways, the experience of Butterfly Kisses caused me to try to figure out who I am and to truly look to God. And, in my case, I didn't hit bottom. I accidentally hit the top.
Right.
But, all the cliches about shattering the glass ceiling,
Yeah. Well, and it's not like you weren't following God up to this point either. I mean, that was not the you were still deeply rooted in being a believer and being a Christian, right?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, you're putting in the right perspective. But there will be a crisis that God will purposely put you through so that you have to ask some big questions. And, of course, my questions are what am I going to do now?
Yeah.
What did God put me on this planet to do? And to boil it down, the very simple answer when I was to look at myself and say, okay, I'm a Christian who does music. What do you do with that? A Christian who does music. And there was this new thing called worship leaders.
Mm.
And so my wife and I began to, we went so far as the churches that we looked into was in San Antonio. And we were even considering, maybe leaving the Nashville area.
Mhm.
And we wound up because, yes, as you said, I was reading a lot of theology. I was going through a major conversion inside my conversion to something that's called Reformed theology. We can get to that later. And that led to wanting to get back into ministry in a new way. And as is always interestingly the case, when I was looking all over the world to try to find a place to do ministry, then something opened up in my backyard, and we did a
Ah.
church plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee. People from the Nashville area will know Spring Hill as, oh, that's where all the young people are moving.
Mm.
And so we had a church there that was just full of young marrieds, and that was a great. It was about 4 years that I was just happily doing that, and then got the call to come down here to Fort Myers, which led to our last adventure.
Well, and you've been in Fort Myers now for what, 13 or 14 years. So this has been another decade-long chapter of your life.
Yes, I used to think in terms of, each band I was in, even though they lasted about 9 years, with all of the final tours and all the things that you have to do to finally put a band to rest, it winds up being pretty much a decade. And so when I moved here and I started working with a pastor, I said, if you look at my history, um, I only last about a decade, you know, and he was
Yeah,
fine with that.
yeah,
Um, I've worked with 4 or 5 pastors since then, but
yeah, yeah,
uh, where I guess sometimes pastors are more like rock stars where they come and go. But
yeah.
yeah, so I've been really shocked to uh, look now at the timeline of my life, and my longest running job has been being a music pastor or worship leader, whatever term you want to put on it,
Sure.
where the reason that I love it is it's a lot like what I've done my whole life, and that is I do music in order to do ministry.
What is the passionate thing that drives you right now? I know ministry is part of that. Is that your passion now? Is there a specific cause or a specific thing that you're really driving to see? You mentioned Reformed theology. I don't want to put words in your mouth,
Hmm.
but what is it? What is it that drives you, gets you up in the morning and says, "This is where God's got me planted for right now"?
What drives me is the same thing that drives Christians. But as I think as we look right now in 2020, I think a lot of the planet is asking this question: what is wrong with the world?
Hmm.
And the biblical answer goes back to the fall. We Christians look at what is going on between riots and COVID and all the anger and all the madness and the sadness going on, and the answer really is Jesus.
Amen.
There was
Amen.
one man who is both God and man, and we now have this resurgence of an idea of Marxism. And you remember that Marx talked about the new man
Hmm.
and this idea that socialism is the answer. So I see things now. What I'm passionate about is talking about Christ, because Jesus is the new Adam and the one that we don't know that we're actually looking for. In my studies, I learned about a man named Augustine, one of the
Hmm.
early church fathers in the fourth century. Uh, Augustine lived in a time like we live, where the Roman Empire was falling apart, and he wrote a book called The City of God. And the
Okay.
idea is there is a city of man where we build our Trump towers and we build our World Trade Centers and
Hmm.
we build our ziggurats, and it's like trying to build your stairway to heaven.
We're trying to build the Tower of Babel.
We're building the Tower of Babel again and again and again. Yes,
Yep.
and meanwhile, but Augustine came up with this idea of the city of God. That meanwhile, uh, as we see in history, there somebody will have an empire, and it runs its period of time, maybe 200 years, and then it falls apart, and then another empire comes up,
Yeah.
and then that crumbles, and then there's another empire. And I think we're concerned in the United States, thinking we may be looking at the decline of our country. And it
Yeah.
seems as though so many things are rotting away. And what is the answer to this? And we're looking for politics to be the answer. We're looking to the wrong places for
Yeah.
the answer. Because getting back to this idea of there is a city of God, and that is the Church of Christ, running through all ages, and God continues to build something that's not going away.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we live in what may be, a falling empire, and we see all this anger and stuff, and I think that causes us to realize that truly justice that everyone's talking about and vengeance that we see played out on the news channels, those things are God's business.
Yes.
That God is the only one who can set everything right. Remember when Jesus said, "Behold, I make all things new."
Yes.
So the idea is the new man. We need to look to the second Adam, and the answer lies in the second Adam makes us the new man. And that leads us to, 2 Corinthians 5, that says, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation.
Yeah.
So isn't it unfortunate that the church no longer is preaching these truths in such a way that uh, I think the world is not looking at the church as having the answers. They're looking
Yeah.
at us as being the ones that uh, I don't know how they look at us anymore.
Yeah.
But I know that from God's perspective, we continue to have the gospel. We continue to have the answer. And so I suppose, we churches ought to say to ourselves, we better be preaching Christ, because
Yes.
that is the answer. He is
Yes.
the answer. And the very thing that the world is burning down their own towns trying to figure out, we have in Christ.
And the part that for me is just astounding is we have the answer that is capable of saving everybody, but we're so afraid to share it.
Hmm.
And, a lot of music today even is focusing on our relationship and so forth, but we need to talk about how do we take this so that other people can find this living water that's gonna save them, that's gonna give them energy.
Yes. And that causes, I think it is wonderful, all the history of Christian music. And I think it's also wonderful that you live in a world when you archive stuff and you talk to someone, sometimes decades after they did something in Christian music, you'll find that people have, parts of their lives that are part of a career, and these things come and go. And those of us that get to a point where we're in our 60s actually have a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of perspective in how God is walking us through this stuff. And the great irony is never lost on me that back when I had zero perspective, that's when I was writing songs that people were listening to. And now that I have a little bit of perspective and have a little bit of wisdom, I don't have an audience.
Well, and you had mentioned something earlier in our conversation about the songwriting process, about how sometimes the real gems and stuff come out of the hard places in our life. And that's what I've been praying for lately is that this hard time in our world right now, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's uh, political, social issues, hopefully these hard times are going to bring us back to, oh, the answer is Jesus. And I'm
Hmm.
hoping that we who have that answer are willing to share that answer a little bit more readily.
Yes, and amen.
Well, Randy, one of the things that we do, and I know you and I've communicated about this in the past, is we send out a weekly prayer letter asking for our friends of music to pray for those of you who are making music still. So how can we be praying for you in these upcoming weeks?
Boy, it's really hard to come up with an answer to that. I think that because I work at Westminster Presbyterian Church, we have our little outpost of the kingdom of God. And I'm sure that we would ask for prayer that we faithfully preach God's word and reach our Jerusalem and Samaria and the outermost parts of the earth. We would welcome prayer that I think in the instance of our church here in Fort Myers, we do a good job of sending out missionaries. We do a great job of, writing a check for a missionary, but we often don't do the old-fashioned thing we did back in the Jesus movement in the 70s, and that is just go talk to your neighbor about Jesus. Talk to your friends, people you work with in the office. So I think that what we need is a new sense of personal evangelism. That we do well at professional evangelism, but that one-on-one talk to your neighbor, the mailman, or the guy that lives across the street is really where we need prayer.
I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. It's always fun for me to hear these behind-the-scenes stories of how some of my favorite music came to be. I'm always grateful that you take the time each week to listen to this podcast, and your notes of encouragement are so meaningful to me. I love hearing from each of you. You can drop me a quick email on my website, christianmusicarchive.com/podcast. Oh, and you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter there as well. Another way to get a hold of me is on one of our social media sites. You'll find us at CCM Exchange on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. It would be great if you could help spread the word about this podcast too. Would you tell your friends about these conversations? Or maybe give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. A review also helps let other people know that these conversations are interesting. Well, that does it for this week. To find out more about Randy Thomas or other artists like him, go on over to my website, christianmusicarchive.com. And until we get the chance to chat next week, remember that God loves you. In fact, He's crazy about you.